One of the very first photographic methods was the cyanotype. You can make gorgeous cyanotype images at home very easily, inexpensively. And man, just look at that gorgeous Prussian blue. It's almost an otherworldly photographic image. And this is the hallmark of cyanotype. I was getting into an experimental mood recently, and I wanted to use cyanotype as a basis for doing watercolor paintings, which I did and I am doing, and I will have a video on that probably next week. But I thought I would do a basic tutorial on how you can make cyanotype at home. They are so much fun to do, and if you have kids, they will absolutely love this, and they'll want to give it a try too. I'm going to explain the most simple and easiest to control cyanotype method. And I'll say you can do some really inventive things with the same cyanotype solutions, but let's start with the basics. First thing is to gather up things that you'd like to make images of. And I'm going to go back to the roots of cyanotype, where Anna Atkins created some of the very first cyanotypes with botanicals in the early 1840s. So, sticks, acorns, and feathers for me. And I have a number of other materials which I will list in the description, but just the cyanotype solution, some paper, and a brush. One of the interesting things about the images created with cyanotype is that they are negatives. That is, the objects will appear white on the print and the space around it will be blue. It's a light-sensitive process, so it would be best to find a darker room to do this. Doesn't need to be dark at this point, but you will need to find a dark area or a really good dark box in a little bit. Next thing we'll do is mix the cyanotype solution. It's a two-part mixture, usually 1-to-1, a part A and a part B. And it's basically a UV-sensitive iron compound. Now, you must use the mixture within a couple hours, so only mix up as much as you're going to use in each session. This stuff goes a long, long way, let me tell you. I could have easily covered 6 or 8 pieces of paper with the amount that I mixed up here. And I actually ended up throwing a lot of this away. This solution doesn't seem to stain non-porous surfaces like this little ceramic bowl, but it can absolutely stain your clothes, so be careful. In fact, did you know you can use cyanotype on a dress or a shirt? You can, and that's really, really cool, but only if you intend to do it. So for best results, I'd use watercolor paper for your photographic surface. You'll be getting your paper nice and wet, so you want it to hold up. I'm also using a Hake, Haki, a cheap Japanese brush. I've heard it pronounced so many different ways. I wouldn't use one of your prized watercolor brushes, but if you do, I'll wash it off immediately after finishing. Now, you don't need to put a lot of solution on this paper for it to work well. If the liquid is applied unevenly, this can actually show up in your print. So a single thin coat is probably better than a really uneven coat that's pooling up in areas. Put the paper in a dark place to dry after coating it, and it probably won't take long, maybe 10 or 15 minutes. And when this is dry, the coated paper will be UV sensitive, so you want to work with it in a dark room or subdued light as you're placing objects on the paper. If you want to make sure your objects do not move, you can cover everything with glass or plexiglass, and that will tend to give you really nice crisp lines. And I'm not doing that. I actually want some of the messiness for what I'm doing, and you'll see in the second part how I do that. So we are creating masks, really. The areas that are masked from the sun will not develop and will remain white, and the areas that get sun will turn blue. In fact, one of the first uses of cyanotype was to develop photographs from negative images because it was cheap. And you could do the same thing if you print out a picture with inverted colors on a transparency film. You can create positive blue and white photographs, which is pretty nifty. So you can see that I've put this out into the sun, and you can just watch that cyanotype get dark. To some degree, timing makes a difference. If you have an area covered for only part of the time, you can often get ghost images or partial exposures. Now, I'm doing this intentionally to create some depth, but that's just a stylistic choice. In total, I think I had this out for about a minute or maybe a minute and a half in the Texas sun, so this is a really quick process. Now, when you're done exposing, and I just do this by judging the colors on the paper, nothing too scientific, you'll want to get back into a dark place, or better yet, start washing it off in clean water. You can use a basin like I'm doing, or you can use a hose or a faucet, but what you're looking for is to get rid of the yellowish residue in the unexposed areas. So you should be getting white instead of yellow, and if it's still yellow, it might need a little bit more rinsing. And by the way, I would probably wear gloves. Do as I say, not as I do. I didn't even really think of it. To be on the safe side, I usually do a second rinse in clean water. And then the image will need to fully oxidize, and if you leave it out for days or weeks, it will eventually do that. Or you can use a little trick. Pour some hydrogen peroxide on it. And this will speed up the exposure process. It is almost instantaneous. But this oxidation process is what will give your print that iconic Prussian blue tint. And once that's done, really your print will no longer be photosensitive for the most part. When you're done here, then you can dry your print. I'll usually place it between some paper towels and maybe put a book on top of it, and that will help it to dry flat. What a beautiful, beautiful blue image. I love that. In a second cyanotype print, I'll point out a few things that might be useful to you or maybe just interesting. The first thing I'll point out, you can see how I have a few imperfect areas on my unexposed coated paper. I probably had some liquid cyanotype pooling there. These imperfections can sometimes show up on your print, but it's typically pretty minor, and for me, I'm not at all concerned. I welcome these sorts of unplanned aberrations with this sort of art. It's really fun to use different types of items for your print too. You know, though leaves and flowers are the classical choice, you could use nuts and bolts or glasses, crystal, even your own body parts. I saw a great piece of a comforter on a bed with the images of two sleeping bodies on it. I love that. Or you can print out an image on transparency film and use that. Really, so many cool things that you could do. Some items, like this feather here, are not fully opaque, and it will stay in one position for the duration of the exposure. So let's keep that in mind and see what happens with that. Even with this very simple method, you can get some pretty interesting effects due to opacity and time. And I'm going to put a stick down here as well. It is fully opaque, but it is only in position for about half of the exposure time. So let's keep that in mind and see what happens with that as well. I find it fascinating that while other old forms of photographic reproduction came and went, the daguerreotype, tintypes, and those sorts of things, cyanotype continued to be used well into the 1940s, mostly by draftsmen making what we now call blueprints, and that's why they have that name. It was a cheap and reliable way of making copies. And just a note on this print here, I exposed it for about twice as long as the other one, about 3.5 minutes. I'm going to get a darker blue. Now, I love the looks of this with this greenish, yellowish kind of look, and I love it. I wish it could stay that way. But if I just left it out in the open, it would all turn blue eventually. So you kind of gotta get off that excess stuff that's in the white areas and fix it so that it will no longer be sensitive to light. As I was saying earlier, cyanotype is a great method to use if you want to do some experiments, because the images are bold and it doesn't take much to get started, and you can get results pretty quickly. You can use additives, for instance, that will change the colors a bit. You can expose wet cyanotype. You can tea-wash your final images. You can adjust exposure times. So lots of fun to be had. An interesting thing that I learned, if you keep a fully finished cyanotype print out in the sun, or maybe by a window that has sun, it will eventually bleach out a bit. But here's a cool thing that I didn't know. If you then store it in the dark, those blues will get dark again. So that's pretty cool. I've never had to do this, but it's an interesting piece of cyanotype trivia for you. You can see here I'm going to add some hydrogen peroxide to help finish setting this print. You just see those blues come to life. I love that part. I exposed this for about 3 minutes or 3.5 minutes, a little bit longer than the other one. So we'll get darker blues, and the lines will be a little bit more crisp. Now, looking at that feather image, partially opaque, but it sat still for most of the exposure, you get a nice, pretty, ghosty image. Pretty crisp lines, though, just a hint of a feather. And that stick, totally opaque, but for just half the exposure time. Also a bit of a ghost-like image. It almost looks to me like it's sitting under the surface of a pond. And to me, it's very pretty. And for better or for worse, I'm going to add watercolor and ink to these. That was the object of this experiment. So do check out my video next week and see how that went. It was super fun to try something new, and I love to work with some unpredictable elements. So please subscribe if you can, if you want to be alerted to part 2 of this cyanotype saga, and because it'll make me quite happy. Thank you for stopping by, and I salute you for making it to the end of this video. We'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.